Hello, I'm Kaj Rozga, and welcome to Version Up, one lawyer's journey to digitally transform his legal practice. Thank you for joining. I hope you find some value in listening in, but please don't take anything I say too seriously. This is not my day job, and nothing I say here should be taken to represent the views of my employer. By way of brief background, I'm a senior in-house lawyer at a Global 500 company. I have about 15 years of experience practicing in a combination of government, law firm, and now legal corporate contexts. I call myself a generalist specialist, which is to say I specialize in antitrust law, but my practice involves many of the core aspects of being a lawyer. So I do transactional commercial work, litigation, investigation, regulatory. It kind of runs the gamut. My motivation for doing this podcast is to learn how to smartly deploy technology to streamline my legal practice. There are a lot of predictions out there about generative AI and how it will disrupt the economy and our legal practice in particular. And I want to sort of explore that possibility and be prepared for it. And well short of that high bar, that sort of transformative impact, I think it's safe to say that technology is automating legal work. It's doing it at increasingly complex levels of legal work. And after many false starts with legal tech, this time does feel different. It seems like there's a tremendous amount of attention to legal tech products. There's a lot more funding for these companies, all the startups that are developing these products. And I've also noticed a sort of big change in the legal culture, a culture which can be quite traditional and, let's face it, stuck in its ways. And that has been changing. I've really noticed in my practice and in the course of my career that sort of some of the resistance that we experienced in the past to using technology to take on some basic legal work, that resistance is sort of dropping off increasingly. And there's really a change in the approach that a lot of lawyers have in thinking about how technology can be used to make them better at being lawyers. And so, my view feels like we might be at a real inflection point. And so if that's the case, I want to position myself to take advantage. I don't want to be left behind. I imagine a lot of you do not either. And so that is the main sort of driver for going on this journey. And I very much welcome you joining me in that. You know, I guess that's the optimistic sort of take. Maybe the realist counterbalance to that would be that, at the same time, I don't want to blindly dive into the deep end of the pool here. My goal here is to be really methodical, tactical at achieving effective deployment of technology in my legal practice. And I imagine a lot of you are too, meaning, you may feel very optimistic about where the technology is headed and how adoption is picking up in our practice, in our industry. But you probably have a lot of reasons, like I do, for wanting to be very careful and think it through before sort of just plunging into deploying these sorts of products and maybe experiencing some of the consequences. So this podcast is really going to be guided by that framework. And I'm going to try to unpack, what does the legal landscape look like? What does the legal tech landscape look like? What tools are available? What do those tools do well? What do they not do well? How do multiple tools fit together into a cohesive system or a stack in sort of, tech lingo? And how do you go about selecting the right tool? And if you've managed to find the right tool, how do you successfully deploy it in practice? It might be you deploying it yourself, and you might have a team around you, or you might be, transforming something, an entire legal function. So those are sort of the guiding principles, the guiding questions that I want to tackle. And I hope that, through this process, I will come out the other end with a better knowledge of where are the opportunities to use legal tech products and software and other forms of automation to improve my legal practice. And I hope you come along for that journey. And my desires for all of us to come out of that journey with a bit of an extra edge in our practice. So let's kick things off with the first episode. Today, we will cover a few questions, really fundamental questions. Sort of, let's start the baseline with what is legal tech, and what is the current sort of state of play, and what does the near-term future perhaps look like for legal tech? What's legal tech good for? And in particular, what are some reasonable expectations to have for its utility? And then finally, what are the risks of using legal tech? What are the potential downsides of deploying software and other tools to automate your legal practice? And what can go wrong if you don't do it right? I always want to balance out the pluses with the potential minuses. And so let's get started. That first question, the kind of foundational one is, what is legal tech? It's a term I know we've probably all heard thrown around, and it probably doesn't have one set definition. My definition is essentially that it's software or other, forms of technological tools available to us that make lawyers more efficient or make entire legal departments more efficient. Could be even entire law firms. Some legal tech that you probably have already heard of would be things like your document management systems, DMS. You might have a time tracker that you've been using that helps you automate how you keep track of time for all you out there still billing time by the 8-minute increments at law firms. You also might be familiar with e-billing tools or e-discovery vendor tools. Those are all forms of legal tech. So, you're using it and you may not realize it. The idea of automating processes and automating legal work and automating back office work, it's been with us for a long time. And well before generative AI came along to really make this a headline grabbing development, these things were all going on in the background. And we've all been slowly deploying these tools. So how does software improve efficiency of legal operations? I mean, that's sort of to me the ultimate question here is, as lawyers, whether we're running a practice, whether we are in the legal department, we are, striving to operate efficiently just like any other business unit would. And so, how does legal tech help you improve your efficiency? For me, what it comes down to ultimately is automating something that you do manually, meaning you take something that, requires, creating a spreadsheet or creating lists or checklists or Word documents, things that require you to continuously come back to the same templates and forms of documents, and figuring out a way to automate that. And the bottom line or the goal there is to take that task, that manual task, and do it in less time, and ideally have the output be more accurate. I always think of it in both of those ways. I don't just focus on the time savings or the cost savings. I also think about accuracy, right? Because as we all know, as lawyers, there's a lot of work that can be repetitive. There's a lot of work that can be almost, homework like. And, that can be a bit of a painful thing to do just because it's, tiresome, but it can also be something where you can slip up, right? And the more you have to do a repetitive task, your brain's not super alert and you might make a typo when you're entering something. So accuracy to me is truly as important here as is efficiency in terms of taking less time to complete the task. So how else does software improve efficiency of your legal operations? Well, I think integration with other tools is another important part that I want to explore in this podcast, which is, how do you take different tools across departments or across functions, connect them and have them operate together in a way that's more efficient than maybe any individual one would be operating. And so let me take an example here. I think it might be helpful to just sort of stop for a second and think through an example that, most lawyers at some point in their career probably have had to deal with if they've worked in a law firm, which is keeping track of your time. And, if you really want to sort of track this all the way back, you can imagine for some of those who've been practicing longer, keeping track of time with a pen and paper. I think the first time I ever was instructed on keeping time, the partner that was talking to me said that, one way you could do it is pen and paper. Now I skipped that part and went to something a little more digital, but, even at that time, 15 years ago, that was not completely unusual to see. So, the starting point is a pad and a pen and keeping track of, which matters you're working on. And we can all imagine that sounds at this point, that sounds painful, right? So where did things go from there? Well, obviously the first step of it was to to digitalize that, right? To take something that's been written down on paper and put it in digital form and have it be something you can put in your computer, for example, type in a word processor. But of course, still you have to input it manually, right? So what came next in the evolution? Well, we have time trackers eventually, right? These are very simple little software programs that you check off which matter you're working on. You tick the box, and the ticker starts going. And when you're done, you turn it off, right? And in the meantime, you can input a description of the work you're doing. And that's already a big step, right? I mean, going from pen and paper where we started to being able to click a button and have it automatically track the time, that's already saving us time and becoming more efficient, not relying on memory after the fact, et cetera. And so where does it progress from there? I mean, it hasn't stopped there, right? The journey for, that particular manual process has continued to get more efficient. So eventually we've seen, billing get integrated with tracking. We've seen tracking get integrated with billing software. And so then you get, automatic generation of bills based on the entry that you put into the program. And then it doesn't stop there, right? Because after that, we've seen AI powered functionality added to your timekeeping software. So now you've got AI that can capture bad entries, typos, duplicative entries, et cetera, so that, you're not finding out from your client that there's something wrong with the bill. You're catching that before it goes out the door. And it doesn't even stop there. We've moved on to further sort of evolution in timekeeping, so that we have integration with productivity suites. Truly, and I guess on the back end, you could really go all the way to the data analytics that can be used to achieve revenue capture, for example. Now there are these providers that will help you identify ways in which, from your billing entries, identifies ways in which maybe you're missing chances to be capturing revenue. So, I mean, that's just one life cycle, right? It's one example of something that we all have done, many of us have done as lawyers, just to give you a sense of like, what are we talking about when we talk about automating a manual process? So, you know, some terminology you'll see thrown around is SaaS, which is software as a service, which is really the predominant way that now legal tech tools are sold and utilized, which is that they're hosted on the cloud. You no longer have, an on-premise, server sort of locally hosted program. You have a program that's really hosted on the cloud. It's maintained on the cloud by the service provider, and you pay a subscription. And there's a lot of efficiency there. There are some cybersecurity considerations. We will absolutely have an episode about that at some point. But, putting aside the big cybersecurity caveat, having a SaaS program otherwise is extremely efficient way to not have to, get buried in dealing with the day-to-day of making sure the program works. The service provider makes sure that happens, and you just, use the program and that's it. And then finally, I want to kind of zoom out and just think about, we used one example, the billing software example, but that's just one example of what is just a massive web of interrelated, interconnected legal software tools. And you'll see that referred to as LegalTech stack. That's a term that you'll see used in, lots of technology markets. And a stack is just the notion that, you don't just have one individual mega program doing everything for you. You have a series of applications, a series of tools that each are performing some niche function for you. And some of them might be operating on an island, and others might be interoperable and speaking to the other programs. And so, ultimately you have this sort of this web of connected products that on the whole are, leveraging each other to really maximize the benefits you can have from those programs. And, we'll get to this in a minute, but the stack, the legal tech stack at the moment is just astonishing how many vendors, how many products are out there. So, and how you define what's in the stack is also very much up for debate. But, there's already emerging a lot of categories of functions or products that you'll hear a lot about when you speak to legal tech vendors. So just to kind of go through a few of those, billing is a big one, a lot of billing related software. We already talked about timekeeping. You, of course, have a lot of productivity tools. So, imagine anything that's like, your Google Suite or your Microsoft 365 suite that's focused somehow on a legal workflow. That's the kind of productivity tool I'm thinking of. We have contract management, right? Vendors provide, services that help you track, manage, edit, redline your contracts. We have document management. We already talked about that as an example. Your DMS, places where you host your documents on the cloud. It makes it easier to manage and deal with them. There is matter intake and matter management services as well. Those are like project management tools that help you keep track of your matters. There's increasingly tools that provide data and analytics, data analytics for basically taking data from other parts of your tech stack and giving you insights into where you might have risk blind spots or where you might have opportunities for improving your efficiency and maybe injecting new workflows, et cetera. There's legal research and drafting. Of course, that's one I think everyone's familiar with as a lawyer at some point. They've utilized, sort of some of those legacy legal research, legal services vendors to do legal research. And of course, e-discovery, right? Anyone who's been involved in litigation, investigations, whether you're in-house or outside counsel, whether you're in the government, you're familiar with all the big vendors and the big services that are available to help manage the really difficult, painful process of handling a discovery. So, that's just a list or example of some of the sort of categories that make up the legal tech stack. And again, ideally, you're working towards a steady state in which these things are talking to each other and they're learning from each other and gaining insights from each other. And, you really ideally are having a 2 + 2 = 5 as you start achieving that kind of interoperability. So that's just a brief overview of what is legal tech. The next topic that I wanted to cover today was what is the current state of play of the industry? I think this is kind of an important place to start, frankly, because, lawyers have been lawyering for a long time, a very long time, to many people's dismay, maybe. And so what, to me, the takeaway from that is to change how we as lawyers do our work, you have to really show us a compelling case for it. I mean, to sort of take something that's been working for as long as it has been working and to take something that people have been doing in a certain way for a long time, maybe their entire career, and to tell them to change that, to modify it, you really have to have a compelling reason to do so. Because ultimately, from my perspective, changing something about my practice is kind of like making a bet. I'm making a bet that this change is going to end up in the long run being something that gives me some return on that investment. When I change something about my legal practice, I'm taking on some sort of cost in when I do that. And so that cost might be money, right? It could be something simple like just a subscription fee for the software program. But it's more complicated than that. It could be my reputation, right? I could be putting my reputation on the line internally by pushing for as making a certain change in how we do our practice or work. I could be using up political capital, right? I mean, we all know everyone has a boss and everyone needs to justify what they're doing to someone. And so to the extent that you're asking to change something about how you do your work, maybe you're asking to deploy a new legal tech tool, that means you may not have the political sort of capital to ask for something else that's important to you. And then, of course, the other cost that, you might be incurring is your time. By changing how you do your legal practice, it takes time to make a change. You've gotten in a flow, you've gotten in a rhythm, you have a way of doing things, and to now stop, adjust that, learn a new way, make a change, bring in, maybe some additional steps in terms of onboarding a new software program, et cetera. That takes time. And for lawyers, whether you're billing your time or not, your time is always very precious because it's rare. You don't have a lot of extra time, and so you want to make sure you're using it efficiently. So in my view, when you're asking someone to change how they do their work, and I'll just speak as a lawyer, I won't speak for others. I'm sure this is true for everyone else in their respective roles as well. But for me, you're really asking me to take on some costs, and so what that means is I need to know or have some pretty good confidence that there's some sort of return coming, right? There's some sort of return on that investment that I'm making. And that could be efficiency, meaning, something just takes, less time to complete. It could be effectiveness. Again, it could be that either I'm eliminating errors or I'm improving accuracy in some way of the work that I'm doing. It could be cutting costs, taking out perhaps the need for, a point 0.1 FTE or something like that. Or it could be even increasing revenues, right? Lawyers are not just cost centers, even in house, but certainly, of course, an outside counsel perspective, lawyers are the revenue drivers. So it could also be a return on investment that actually generates more revenue. Maybe allows you to bill extra time, et cetera. So, to me, those are sort of the key, kind of costs and returns or costs and benefits I'm going to be weighing if I'm thinking about changing something about my practice. So bottom line is before I make that bet, I really got to feel confident that it's going to pay off or that, it's worth taking the risk that, it doesn't. And so the challenge becomes that, we as lawyers know our practice. We know how to do things the way we've been doing them. And we have a sense that there's technology out there that can help us, but we're not technologists. So, we look for other signals to try to understand, engage, what is this legal tech thing? Is it worth my time? Do I need to start devoting some time every week to doing some research on this? Do I need to maybe hire someone on my staff to be thinking about these issues? And so we look for signals about the industry more broadly to help us sort of gauge, you know, when to start dipping our toes in. And so, the kinds of things that I would be looking at and I look at is what are my peers doing? What is the long-term prospect of the legal tech industry? What is the health of the legal tech industry? What do the experts say about, what's going on in legal tech? And so, with that, I guess I wanted to provide, my kind of brief overview of the current state of play in legal tech, just to help you sort of, maybe have a bit of a shortcut and in terms of your thinking about, is the time right for you to be really thinking about these things? And I'd say that, the COVID-19 work from home moment was truly, in my view, a transformational moment for the digitalization of legal practice. I had been working in law firm practice for almost a decade at that point, and I'd seen the sort of shift towards digitalization, of course, but it really felt like a leap at that point. And in my view, it really got law firms in particular and lawyers more generally over the technology hump, right? It's just a comfort, a trust that came along with the fact that people had to figure out ways to do their work using more technology. And of course, the ubiquity among seeing other lawyers doing the same thing. So I think that to me, the number one driver that makes this feel like really a moment, an inflection point, a moment where we're at the beginning of a really large scale sort of adoption of legal tech tools. To me, it's the sort of permanent effects of COVID-19 kind of work at home transformation that we saw. I think the other thing you kind of can't avoid at this point is just how much AI driven hype there has been in the broader economy, but including in the legal industry. You really can't talk about legal tech without talking about AI at this point. Generative AI, which is the technology sort of driving chatbots, have really made AI accessible and obvious to users in a way that I don't think it was before. I think that, you know, the legal tech stack, some of the examples I went through already, there's already been machine learning powering a lot of those things. And there's already been AI powering a lot of those tools and improving those tools over time. But it felt like more in the background. It felt like not something that was really customer facing. It was just something that was driving the outcome, but maybe the customer, the user didn't really have insight into it. And to me, generative AI and the chatbots have just transformed that and have changed it into a sort of direct interaction that the user now has with what they understand to be artificial intelligence. And you know, uh, that to me is sort of the reality. And I think that's the impact of that is just that there, again, this does feel like a moment that's not just driven by kind of a hype machine. It really feels like a moment that's driven by permanent shifting in how people think about, the use of technology in their practice. And in I guess, the third, to me, the third kind of signal of this sort of the third signal that this moment in time is really a meaningful one and one that could be the start of a permanent sort of transformation in our industry. It's really the explosion in the investment in legal technology. VC funding went for legal tech went from $1 billion in 2021 to 3 billion just 2 years later in 2023, right? So now we've got the sort of post-COVID effect, and then 5 billion in 2025, 2024. So, that is quite an acceleration from one to three to five. That's a lot of money flowing into startups, flowing into the industry to power, innovation, sales, marketing, et cetera. And so, that combined with all the projections being, double digit annual growth in this sector, to me, the writing is on the wall that, this is the time when legal tech is going to start being a regular part of all of our practices. And, what form that takes and how we adapt to it and what do we actually deploy, what do we not is a whole different question. But the question of, do we need to follow this? Do we need to be aware of these trends? Do we need to be thinking about them? To me, the answer to that is yes, unequivocally yes. But at the same time, when you sort of are thinking about what's the current state of play of the legal tech sector, you have to, of course, temper expectations and take a step back and kind of look at the whole picture because, you know, the industry, to me, feels very much in the early stages of its growth phase. There's this like famous hockey stick metaphor that's used in technology, in the technology space, where, all these startups and these sectors are always trying to, get in and experience the sort of huge growth that happens at the part where the hockey stick kind of curves up and you have this, huge kind of accelerating effect on the growth in the market, and massive adoption leads to more massive adoption, and things really blow up and you start getting the unicorns and all that stuff. So that, where are we on the hockey stick curve? I have no idea. I'm not a venture capitalist, but you know, it certainly feels like if the one thing is clear is that, if we are at an early stage of high growth, it's the early stage. If we're not middle, we're not late. This is the beginning of the wave. This is not by any means a market that's approaching mature levels. And one indication of that is just how incredibly fragmented the legal tech market is. You don't have to spend much time browsing the internet to see just the massive volume of vendors offering tools of different kinds with different abilities. There's a lot of options out there, and there are, legacy legal tech providers who have been in the industry for a long time that are expanding out to other verticals or other capabilities. This could be your e-discovery vendor. This could be your sort of legacy legal research database. Those big kind of incumbents, they are all branching out and trying to seize this opportunity. And then you have a massive field of startups, which is frankly one of the more challenging parts of understanding what's out there is navigating that universe of startups, which is where, in my view, the innovation is happening and where some of the coolest features are, but it's also some of the scarier parts of the waters that we're swimming in because of the uncertainty that comes with, deploying a product that's kind of brand new. And I'll get into that, in the course of this podcast, but that fragmentation to me really signals again that we're at the early stages of what is going to be a long period of development, innovation, and ultimately consolidation, I'm sure. And then, finally, thinking about the current state of play of legal tech, I think you have to think about some of the other tailwinds for this industry to really understand, what's driving this acceleration, what makes this the moment where legal tech feels like it's really taking off. And those tailwinds for me are sort of demand side trends that are really driving the adoption of legal software tools. And so a few of these that really jump out to me are, in-house budget constraints at the same time that you've got growing legal tech budgets. So, there's a lot of surveys out there you can take a look at, some great, compliance, legal corporate driven surveys that talk about the pressures that in-house budgets are under, but at the same time, the growth that they're seeing in their ability to budget out deployment of software tools. The other the other tailwind is, personnel hiring freezes or plateauing in growth of hiring, and specifically, of in-house lawyers, counsel, et cetera. To me, another reason why, I think as people are hiring fewer individuals, I think one can be a signal of the anticipation that there's other ways of getting that work done, and technology can certainly be one of those ways. But also, I think a potential accelerant in the sense that, you know, if you don't have enough bodies around to do the work, you're going to figure out another way to do it. And that will naturally, I think, push you towards automation, which will then, lead you to technology. So I think that's another tailwind is just the fact that we're seeing, hiring, at least in legal corporates, is at least in the aggregate, is sort of plateauing in a lot of ways. Finally, not finally, but additionally, a lot of surveys out there will show you just how miserable a lot of lawyers are. I hate to talk about that in such a brash way, but you know, the burnout rates and the quality of life declines among lawyers, including lawyers in legal corporates. It's quite severe. I'm sure some would view it as being at crisis levels, and the challenge there is, if people are burning out, then they're struggling to keep up with their work, and they are probably struggling to put out good quality work. And so one of the obvious ways in which you improve that circumstance is to help those lawyers by automating the work that they're doing manually today and helping them become more efficient so that hopefully when they squeeze 5 minutes of productivity out of their day using technology, that 5 minutes can go to something personal, right? And hopefully the 5 minutes over time becomes 10, 15, 20, et cetera. And hopefully people are getting a little bit of their life back. And hopefully that means that quality of life indicator will improve. But I think that's another driver among legal corporates. I know, leadership within major companies is always thinking about, what is the sort of mental health of their workers, and legal departments are no different. The other tailwind is increasing outside counsel spend. So we've seen significant increases in law firm rates, the amount that law firms bill by the hour for their work. There's a lot of reasons for that. Not going to get into it, but the bottom line is, the trend has been upward. It's been pretty significantly upward. And so as it gets more expensive to hire someone to do work, if you're not hiring someone to do it internally, then again, where are you going to look? I think technology is a pretty clear place to go next to try to address some of those needs that may be required going to outside counsel before. And finally, another tailwind for this industry, I think, is just a competitive labor market for legal corporates. Meaning, I think some specialties it's more so than others, but I think by and large legal corporates are competing for a limited set of talent. And if there's other pressures causing them to be hiring less, and they're also struggling to find the right talent, I think that naturally pushes things towards some sort of solution to help improve efficiency without more bodies, but instead by relying on technology. So that's a bit of an overview of where we are. Current state of play, legal tech. The last two topics I thought would be nice to cover today are really sort of, okay, so what's the upside? What's the downside of deploying these tools at a high level? And I think these next two topics will be the focus of this podcast, but let's just go through it at a high level, just to level set. What are the upsides? Why should you be thinking about deploying legal tech tools in your practice? Why am I thinking about it? I think one thing is there's a huge potential from being an early adopter of these tools, because whether you're in-house, whether you're outside counsel or otherwise, it really has the potential to give you an edge for your practice. I mean, let's be clear. There's a lot of competition out there for law firm services, and generally, a small edge can really help you stand out from the field and have a competitive advantage. So, do you remember being able to Google before your parents' generation could? Do you remember, kind of having a word processor, going further back in time, having a word processor when others were still, using typewriters. I mean, these are huge edges and advantages, and it really makes you almost like a wizard, right? You forget it after the fact because it becomes commonplace and everyone starts doing it. But when you are an early adopter, you're sort of a wizard in the sense because you're doing this magic that no one else can quite probably understand why you're doing it so effectively or so quickly. So I think that's one advantage. The other, doing more with less time or at less cost, again, automating repetitive and simple tasks. Anytime you're able to achieve that, you save yourself some time and you've probably lowered your costs in the process. So doing more with less is to me a sort of, it's not just a benefit of legal tech tools. It might be actually the sort of one of the main things you should be looking for when you're deciding what kind of tool to deploy. Another advantage is going up the value chain as a lawyer. This is for me a big one. The less time I have to spend on rote tasks, the less time I have to spend on some of the more, drudgery that some of us might experience as lawyers in our careers, the more I get to focus on strategic thinking and on core responsibilities that I have. And that just makes me happier. and my brain's more engaged. I feel more satisfied about my work. I feel more proud of my work. And so to me, if the legal tech tools help you become more efficient, if they give you some of that sort of like wizard capability, it's going to free you up to take on some other projects maybe you've been unable to do because you've been, sort of stuck in the trenches working through something that really was a low value but still necessary thing to do, and can be, made more efficient through automation. And I guess the other way I think about this is again this sort of going up the value chain is we are in a knowledge economy as lawyers, and in my view and my experience practicing as a lawyer for 15 years is you have to be constantly leveling up to keep up. You can't just sort of always do things the way they've been done. You will get left behind. And I think, a lot of times it's incremental. We don't notice it. But if you were to stop and think about your practice when you first became a lawyer and what it looks like now, I think you'd be, really sort of check off the list. You'd be shocked at just how you do your work has changed. And, for me, becoming a more senior lawyer has come with more responsibility. It's come with more strategic thinking, et cetera. Part of that, maybe a big part of it, is just becoming better at what I do because I've been doing it for a long time. But I think there's no doubt that I've also been able to focus more on that because I spend less time on a lot of tasks that, I would have been doing 5 years ago without the help of technology. Another upside is, staying ahead of the curve. Really, this is more than just being an early adopter and having an edge in your practice. It's really more about, being positioned to sort of take advantage of the changes that are coming and not playing catch up. Because let's be honest, no one's going to no one lost their job because they didn't know how to Google at the same time, right? No one got pushed out of the workforce because they were slow to, I don't know, start using Gmail or something else that became ubiquitous. You're not going to get pushed out, but you do want to be able to anticipate kind of things, see where things are going, be able to look around the sort of the bend in the road a little bit, and position yourself so that when the changes come, you're quick to respond, quick to adopt, and you're not playing catch up. And then I guess I would just throw in as part of that, it's also a nice bonus that being someone who is staying ahead of the curve, being an early adopter, it's also great marketing. It's great marketing for your law firm, if that's where you are. It's great marketing for your department if you're deploying something internally and in-house. You get to really kind of put yourself up as being on the cutting edge of thinking about how to innovate and how to adapt your practices and adapt your team's work to the times. And I think that's great marketing for whether you're marketing that internally to leadership or whether you're marketing that externally to clients. In my view, it's just a great bonus. It shouldn't be the driver, I think, of deploying these tools. And I think we always have to be cautious about sort of the hype effect that we experience when new things come along like this. But I think a measured approach to deploying technology can also kind of boost your positioning and how you position yourself in your market. So we've already talked about, being more effective, doing more with less, you know, being more accurate in your results and really using automation to avoid mistakes. And, you know, just think about simple things that you probably take for granted now, like spell check, right? You know, writing a brief and not having to read every single word for just for spell checking purposes is pretty neat, in my opinion. Or, you know, blue booking, something else that lawyers who have uh, done, anyone's gone through law school, but also anyone that's practiced in litigation and appellate work or anything that required doing some intensive, legal research and drafting, is very familiar with blue booking, the process of checking your citations, and just think about how automation of that process, has made your life so much easier and more effective and missing mistakes and not having unnecessary oversights. And, I guess to me, rounding out the discussion of what are the benefits or what are the upsides of deploying legal tech is to really provide a major caveat, which is uh, no single solution is transformational. There's not one tool out there that you deploy, no matter how it's branded, how it's marketed, no matter how it's sold to you, no tool that you're going to deploy in this process is going to be transforming your practice. In part, I think that's because, again, lawyers have been lawyering for a long time and we're pretty efficient at it already. And we have quite good ways of getting the work done. And we've been doing it that way for a while and we've fine tuned it for each of our purposes and we've gotten quite efficient. And so, the idea that any one tool can come along and just all of a sudden extract massive efficiency, it's a little out of, I think that's an unreasonable expectation. And so I think the expectation you need to set for yourselves and most importantly, if you're selling this to someone else, right? You're selling this internally to your leadership. Maybe, you're thinking about, how you're going to sell this to your clients externally. I think it's critical to have a reasonable expectation, which is that you're going to achieve singles, not home runs. You're going to chip away and automate specific tasks. You're going to gain specific insights. You're going to achieve particular efficiencies step by step, and you're going to march your way towards a more efficient practice. And ultimately, you will achieve some level of a digital transformation of your practice. But that's going to be done through a series of upgrades and tweaks, and each of those will be building on the last, and you will probably be doing it forever. And there's not going to be an endpoint. But it's going to come incrementally. And I think it's just absolutely important to have that expectation because especially in this sort of hyped up environment that we find ourselves in, especially around generative AI, it would not be wrong for you to walk away from a quick level read of AI and expect things that I think are not reasonable to expect. I think that in some ways the industry has set itself up for disappointing people because I think the expectations that the average person who doesn't know the technology, someone like myself, the expectations you would have based on just following the news or just talking to vendors, you really might think that the sky's the limit. And again, if you oversell that internally, then you've really put yourself in a bad spot where you've overpromised. And then when you do finally come to the table with a specific tool that you want to deploy, you may not have that trust any longer that you need to get approval. So I think that's a huge caveat on the upsides. So the last topic here to cover today is what are the risks of deploying legal tech? What happens if you do it wrongly? And, I think this is two sides of the risks and the downsides and then the upsides on the other hand are just two sides of the same coin. The same things that make legal tech a great opportunity is the same thing that makes it fraught with risks. And I guess you really can't have this discussion without acknowledging that lawyers are risk averse. And that's not a design flaw. It's actually at the core of how lawyers uniquely add value to a business. I think the sort of joke about lawyers being risk averse, it's to me, it kind of misses the point, which is that you need your lawyers to be risk averse, right? You don't want your lawyers to be thinking like your product development team. And so because we are risk averse by design, that means that when you're talking about deploying technology that will change how you do your legal practice, You cannot take a startup mentality for making that decision because lawyers are not in a position to iterate, right? We're not in a position to change our practice for 1 week, see how it goes, and then just change it back if it doesn't work. We're not, you know, in the industry, we're not in a service where we can move fast and break things and then kind of then reverse course and undo the changes that didn't work and keep the ones that did. The downside of a mistake is just too high for lawyers. When they're advising clients externally or internally, making a mistake has too big of a repercussion for us reputationally, and also just sort of again in undermining the key value that we add. That we are going to be very careful when we deploy these tools, which are going to be changing something about how we do our legal work. So that sort of risk averse mentality impacts any aspect of a lawyer's practice that affects the quality or accuracy of the legal services they're providing, and that includes deploying technology to support their legal practice. So to me, the fragmented legal tech market means that there's a lot of hyped up tools, there's a lot of ineffective tools. There are tools being offered by companies that will not exist, maybe in 6 months, and maybe a little longer. And so all those things, which I think are true to some extent, mean that lawyers are going to approach this sort of process carefully. So to me, with that kind of framing of I think why lawyers are really they're going to be viewing a deployment of technology differently than some of the other functions at a company or a business or a law firm will be. And so the main risk from a lawyer's perspective when deploying these tools as I see, is fourfold. What are the four kind of risks that you should be thinking about when you're thinking about, what's the downside of deploying a tool? Number one, I think this is top of mind for every lawyer, is just it makes a mistake. You deploy something that does it wrong, and it doesn't just make you not more efficient. It actually makes you less effective because you've made a mistake that you wouldn't have with your other way of doing things before. For example, in the generative AI context, there's a lot of talk out there about hallucinations and basically chatbots making things up. And I've experienced this a lot. I've been playing around with tools. So that's a very frightening thing to a lawyer. Again, if you appreciate and understand what a lawyer's role is, you will understand that is just it's an absolute deal breaker for a lawyer to have a tool that makes mistakes. So that's number one, is just a tool that doesn't get it right. The next one is making a wrong bet. Again, given that the market here is so fragmented, there are so many tools out there, it can be very difficult to sort of isolate the noise and the signal and figure out which tools are actually have the features that you think they do. And so there's just, at this moment in time, especially, there's a risk of picking the wrong tool. And in that process, you will have spent time, you will have spent money, you will have used up political capital. You would have you would have incurred a lot of costs to transition to that tool. And so if you make the wrong bet, that can have devastating consequences because you might lose trust, you might lose budget, you might lose the ability to then make a better bet next time. And in the meantime, you would have incurred all these costs as well. The other risk I would flag for deploying legal tech is moving thoughtlessly or without purpose. One of the challenges for deploying technology in a B2B and enterprise technology in a kind of business context is you might have a great tool, it might work really well, you might even be able to you know get it up and running really quickly, but then the actual use of the tool by the users is low, meaning, people don't actually use the tool. Even though it's good, people might just not go and work it into their day to day, and it sits there unused, and eventually it just gets, turned off because, eventually someone looks at the data and realizes no one's logging in, no one's using this tool. Why are we paying for it? So, we're going to talk a lot about that in this podcast, which is how do you set up your organization? How do you set things up so that once you have the tool, that it actually gets used, and sort of the foundational work that you need to do in advance of onboarding a new tool. But, that is something to be really thought of carefully because you don't want to do everything right and then have it fail at the last step of the process after you've deployed it. You also don't want to be in a position where you need to then later incur more costs to fix some of the, thoughtless deployment you might have done. For example, if there was some foundational work that had to be done that you skipped, and then you've got this tool up and live and you're paying big bucks for it, and then you realize, okay, I got to go back and fix the foundation. It's kind of like, buying a house with a broken foundation. You don't want to be in a position where you got to fix the foundation. If you just need to, like, fix a broken window, not a big deal, but you don't want to have to go back and pour new concrete. And then lastly, the last sort of the four downsides of deploying legal tech is again, it's really the idea of overpromising what the capabilities are. And, whoever your constituents are, whoever your stakeholders are, whoever your clients are, you're going to be selling this to someone, maybe many different layers of people or of parties. You're going to be selling the idea that this tool is good, it should be used. If you overpromise its capabilities, if you overpromise the payoff on the other end, you overpromise the benefit to the organization of deploying that tool, you're really setting yourself up to fail, and you're going to lose trust. You're going to waste political capital and potentially undermine future efforts. And again, I think because of the way these tools can be marketed and sold and the way they're discussed in the media, it's very easy to have very high expectations for them. And maybe ultimately those high expectations do bear out over time. But right now is not a time to promise the sky. You really want to have very reasonable promises that can be measured and tracked and then shown to your constituents once you have deployed the product. So that's it for this episode. I, really just wanted to provide a kind of framework for some of the main considerations and understanding what legal tech is and how it's used, and, how to start thinking about navigating the space. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things. I hope you got some inspiration for how to version up your legal practice. On the next episode, I'll do a high-level survey of the legal tech landscape and go into a more detailed overview of the tech stack. So tune in for that. For now, thank you for listening to this episode of Version Up. If you have comments or questions, you can reach me at kajrozga@gmail.com. And this podcast has been bootstrapped by me, Kaj Rozga, with music by Brett Ryback.